Hi everybody, it's Courtney and I'm here with another video for Miss Ink Stamps. And today we are going to be creating 11 different backgrounds using some of the new stencils by Miss Ink. There's also a giveaway going over on Instagram, so I will link that below. You'll want to check that out. So here are the stencils that I am going to be using for all of my cards today. So for the first card, we're just going to be doing some simple ink blending. So we've all done this before. I am going to be working on a scrap piece of paper. I'm laying my card panel flat down on the back of the stencil and taping all four sides down with some post-it note tape. You can use washi tape or whatever. I find that this gives the best results and it doesn't shift around and doesn't get in the way. So I'm going to be using Distress Oxides here, and I'm using Tumbled Glass, Stormy Sky, Faded Jeans, and Chipped Sapphire. And I'm going right in the direction of the stencil. And you can see that I have my post-it note tape there kind of hanging off the sides and my fingers keep getting stuck to it. So my stencil's shifting a little bit. So you want to be careful where you place your fingers because it will obviously stick to either your washi tape or your post-it note tape, whatever you're using to hold down that stencil. You can see I totally picked it up that time, but very, very easy to reposition. So I started off with the Tumbled Glass, moved on to the Stormy Sky, and went back to that Tumbled Glass to kind of get those areas to blend a little bit. Next, I'm going in with the Faded Jeans, and then again back to that Stormy Sky just to make sure that those colors blend well together. And then finally finishing off with the Chipped Sapphire on the very top. And normally I work in a circular motion when I'm doing ink blending, but in this case I'm moving back and forth. I'm using a blending brush, but you can certainly use a regular ink blending tool, pretty much get the same results. So here I'm going to move in the opposite direction and just make sure that all of my colors are well blended together, and then eventually reaching that bottom again where I had that Tumbled Glass. For the blending brushes, somebody had asked me if I use a different brush each and every time. As long as I'm using the same color family, I typically use the same brush. I work on a scrap piece of paper, so I kind of just scribble that off. So here is our first background. You can see that we have our white lines in between. For this one, we're going to pretty much do the same thing. But first, I'm going to put a very light layer of ink down on my panel first. So I'm working in the same order as I plan on working once my stencil is down, but you can see it's very, very light, and I'm not worried about getting a blend because you're not going to notice it when it's all said and done. I just want a light layer of color so that where my stencil lays, it's not completely white showing through, if that makes any sense. So I forgot to mention the first stencil I used is called the Scallop Stencil. This one I'm taping down the same way, and I'm basically going to do the same thing. I already have a base layer down, so I'm just going to start with my darkest color, kind of work my way down, Chipped Sapphire, then the Faded Jeans, then the Stormy Sky, and then finish off with the Tumbled Glass. But you can see that, again, my fingers are getting stuck. So I have a Band-Aid on my one finger too. So that is definitely getting stuck to my post-it note tape. So I did have a little bit of shifting, but if that happens, you can just cut down your panel and it won't really make too much of a difference. This is the Waves stencil. So it's kind of similar to the first one, but it's more of a wavy line rather than a scalloped line. So here I am finishing off with the Tumbled Glass, that's what it is. And then I'll go ahead and remove my stencil, and you can see that I have a little bit of smudging on the top, but that's okay. I'm going to end up cutting these panels down anyway. So next, and now that the ink blending is done, we are going to move on to some more ink blending, but this time do this a little bit differently. I'm going to do my ink blending on my panel first, and I am using Abandoned Coral, Carved Pumpkin, Picked Raspberry, and Seedless Preserves. And I'm going to do my ink blending the same way as I always do, but I did keep this in here just in case you guys struggle with ink blending. So I started off with my Abandoned Coral, then I laid down my Carved Pumpkin, then my Picked Raspberry, and then my Seedless Preserves on the top. You can see I'm not worried about getting a blend. Right now I'm just putting down my color to get the paper saturated a little bit and to kind of get my spacing correct. Once I reach that Seedless Preserves, I'm going to add a whole bunch of that. And I'm again just wiping off my brush on my scrap piece of paper. Then I'm going to go in the opposite direction and kind of keep going back and forth with 2 colors at a time, just making sure that those 2 colors blend before I move down to the next little section here with my carved pumpkin. Going to add a little bit more of that carved pumpkin, and then again going back to that picked raspberry to make sure that those colors blend together. And you just kind of have to move back and forth until you're happy with the blend that you're getting. Next, I'm moving back to that abandoned coral, and I'm just going to take a scrap piece of paper to hold on to my paper. This is actually a scrap backing of some masking paper, but it works. This way it'll avoid getting fingerprints. The distress oxides do take some time to dry. Once I'm happy with the blend, I am going to let my panel dry for just a few minutes so that I don't leave fingerprints when I move on to the next step. Again, I taped down my panel there to this stencil, which this is the halftone diamond stencil. And I have 2 folded up pieces of paper towel here. One is saturated with water, one is dry. I am using a regular ink blending tool by Ranger. You can pretty much use anything here. I am dipping this into the water, tapping that off onto my dry paper towel there, and then just dabbing that through the little openings of the stencil. And because the distress oxides react with water, this will leave a very faint impression where your stencil is. Now, you don't want your ink blending tool to be too saturated because the water will just seep between the lines of the stencil, but you want it wet enough where it is going to react with that ink. So I continue to go around that entire area of the stencil, and once that is done, I am going to take a dry paper towel and just basically lay that directly over my card panel to pick up any excess ink that's kind of just laying on top. And then I will carefully remove my Post-it note tape as well as that stencil. And it's a little hard to see on camera, but you can see that you have those impressions of the stencil. So next I am taking a piece of black cardstock for my next technique here, and I'm going to be doing a little bit of masking here with some Post-it note tape because I don't want to cover the entire panel. And you'll probably see why in just a minute. So once I have my panel masked out, I'm going to go ahead and again tape this down backwards or upside down to my stencil, and this is the leafy green stencil. And then I'm going to be using some white pigment ink, and I'm using the unicorn white pigment ink by Hero Arts and a white or a ink blending tool by Ranger, and I'm just going to pounce on this color. This is kind of an old school technique. It's called black magic, which typically you use with a solid stamp, but in this case I'm using a stencil. So the pigment ink does take a very long time to dry. You can heat it with your heat tool to speed up the process, but I prefer to air dry it just because I hate when my paper warps. So I let this dry for about 15 minutes or so, and then I will go ahead and carefully remove the masks and that tape that we had holding down that stencil. You can kind of touch the tip of your finger to the ink blended area, and if you're not picking up any ink, it's dry enough. So I'm gonna bring out my Arteza color pencils, and I'm just using 3 colors here. The coloring does not have to be perfect. In fact, you could probably go in with just a solid color. Going to add a little bit of shading to the tips of each of the leaves, blending that out with a mid-tone green, and then I'm going to fill in the entire thing with that highlight green. Now, this is one of the reasons why I masked out this area, because this is a little bit time consuming, especially if you're coloring them all the same color like I did. It would probably kind of be a little bit more interesting and not so boring if I kind of switched up the colors, but I didn't. So this gave me a little bit less to color and added a little bit extra interest to the card itself. So you can see this really makes it pop. Even though most colored pencils are opaque, this will really bring out the color of the colored pencils. So that is the black magic technique. So next we're going to move on to the glitter paste. So I taped down my stencil same way as I always did, and I'm using the Nuvo glimmer paste. I think it's called glimmer paste. And I'm not adding this to the entire panel. I'm kind of just globbing it in the middle and spreading it out as far as it goes. I'm not worried about getting all the way to the edges or all the way to the sides of the panel. I pretty much want this just in the center and kind of look a little bit globby. So once I'm happy with the placement of it, I want to make sure that this is nice and smooth, being very careful to remove my stencil, and you will want to clean this off immediately. And then you'll want to put this aside to dry for probably about at least an hour to 2 hours. Next, I'm going to mix my glimmer paste with some Picked Raspberry Distress Oxide ink. So you can make this any color you want. No need to buy more than one color. Just buy the clear and you can make it any color you want as long as you have some inks. And you don't necessarily need to use distress inks for this. You can pretty much use any water-based ink. So again, just plopping this in the middle and spreading that out. For the clear glimmer paste, that was the Mouse Flower stencil, and for the pink, it's the Paint Stroke Floral stencil. So again, putting that aside to dry for a couple of hours before adding my sentiment. And next we're going to move on to some dry embossing. This is the Stripes stencil, and I am just making the sandwich for my die cutting machine, which I have a Gemini, the same way as I would be if I was embossing with a wafer die. Running that through my machine, and you can see that this gives a nice impression, a beautiful background that is really little effort. So next we're going to go ahead and heat emboss. So I am treating my whole panel here with my anti-static tool, and then I'm going to tape down my stencil, and this is the Jitters stencil, and I'm taping this down flat to my scrap piece of paper here because I don't want to get fingerprints on my card panel. So I'm not taping this down like I normally do. I'm just being careful not to put that tape directly over my panel itself or over my cardstock itself. Next, I'm going to take my Versamark ink pad here, and you can use any embossing ink, but you want to make sure that whatever embossing ink you have, the ink pad itself is squishy. Some of them are a little bit harder, or they're more of a foam pad, or maybe not like a felt pad, I guess I could say. You want to make sure it's squishy because you want to get in between those lines of the stencil. I'm going to be using Gold Pearl embossing powder by Wow. This is one of my favorite embossing powders, and I'm going to cover up my entire panel, and you can see that I got some messy areas there, and that's because I just re-inked my Versamark ink pad and probably inked it up a little bit too much. So I had some ink squishing in between the lines of the stencil, but I'm okay with that because it kind of gives a vintage look. You want to make sure that you heat your heat gun up for about 30 to 45 seconds before bringing that to the paper, and that will minimize the warping that you have being you're adding so much heat to this panel. So that is the heat embossing. Next, we're going to move on to some acrylic paints, which we probably all have. So I'm just squeezing these out onto a little piece of acetate there, and I'm using an ink blending tool. You can use a sponge here. You can pretty much use anything, but I like to have a little bit of texture. So I have taped down the halftone rectangles stencil here, and I'm just going to pounce on my color, and I'm going to kind of mix them together here and there to make sure that they blend, but I'm pouncing it so that I leave behind a little bit of texture. Now, you may have a little bit of seeping between the lines of your stencil, but again, I'm okay with that because it does give it kind of like a mixed media look, and I'm fine with that. If you don't want that, I suggest you use a double-sided adhesive on your stencil to make sure it's completely laying flat and not just tape it down with Post-it note tape or washi tape. So again, making sure that I clean this stencil off immediately and letting my panel dry. Next, we're moving on to the foiling. So I am taping down my circular Harlequin stencil onto my panel here, and again taping this down on all four sides or all four corners that are kind of hanging off my panel. And I'm using Tombow Mono multi glue. I know that you can use, I think there is a glue specifically for foiling, but I find that this works great because it does dry repositionable. So I'm just going to squish a little bit out onto my scrap paper, and again using just an ink blending tool. You can just use a sponge here, and I'm pouncing on the glue in between the lines of the stencil, trying to be careful not to go beyond the stencil on all four of those corners where I have a little bit of a gap there where the stencil didn't cover. But you want to make sure that you're really getting good coverage. So you're going to pounce this on quite a bit. You can't really tell where you've covered it. So some of the areas I'm going over multiple times just to make sure that I have enough glue on there. Going to carefully remove my stencil there, again cleaning this off immediately, and I let this dry for maybe about 10 minutes or so. You do want to make sure that the glue is dry before adding your foil. So I'm going to go ahead and place down my foil here and just press that down with my fingers to make sure that it is stuck down before bringing in my bone folder. So I'm adding quite a bit of pressure here, and as you're doing this, you can't really see it on camera, but as you're moving your bone folder back and forth, you'll start to see the little lines from the stencil kind of showing through, so you know which areas have really stuck down. I can start to peel back the corner a little bit just to make sure that I'm getting good coverage before completely removing the foil, to see if I need to add a little bit more pressure, and I did in that lower right hand corner. Just going to carefully remove this to make sure I don't need to reapply any of those areas, and there you have your foiling. So for the last technique here, I'm going to be doing some alcohol, using some alcohol ink. So I have the alcohol ink cardstock here because I'm out of Yupo paper, but you can certainly use Yupo paper. I'm going to use a couple different colors of the alcohol pearl by Ranger and the blending solution, I think you call it. I don't know. I'll link it below. And I'm just going to kind of let that spread out on its own. And you do want to make sure that this is completely dry before moving on to the next step. I'm adding a little bit of pink there and a little bit more of that blending solution just to make sure that this kind of spreads evenly. And I think I let it dry for maybe about a half an hour just to be 100% sure that it was dry. So next I'm going to go ahead and use my backgammon stencil, and I'm going to be using regular rubbing alcohol that you can get from the pharmacy, or I think mine is from Walmart. And I'm kind of playing around with my stencil. I wasn't sure which position I wanted it in, and I am going to tape this down on all four sides just to make sure it doesn't shift. And I'm just going to use a paper towel, but you can use an ink blending tool, you can use a sponge, you can use whatever's easiest for you. And I'm just going to pour a little bit of that alcohol, or that rubbing alcohol, onto that paper towel and kind of just rub this back and forth where my stencil openings are. At first I was dabbing it, but I really wasn't getting any results there. So I ended up applying a little bit of pressure and just rubbing this back and forth, and you can see some of that ink starting to move or starting to lift a little bit. You can definitely tell on your paper towel because it will be pink, purple, and blue. So this is going to give a really subtle look, but once you remove your stencil, you will want to make sure that this is dry for another couple of minutes before adhering this to your card panel. So I did just add the same sentiment to each and every one of the cards to make it really nice and easy, and you always need thank you cards. So here's a quick look at all of the cards that we created today, starting with the ink blending, and then we will move on to the black magic technique, then the two glimmer paste or glitter paste technique, the heat embossing, the acrylic paint, the foiling, and finally the alcohol lift, which obviously I forgot to add a sentiment to. But that is it for today, guys. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.